Amen. Exodus chapter 21. In Exodus chapter 21, what we find here is God, through Moses, is giving, as it says in verse 1, judgments or ordinances. He is giving judgments or ordinances concerning the things that He has already revealed in the 10 Commandments. He is going to build upon those 10 pillars the rest of the law. And in verses 1 through 11, he talks about the laws concerning servants or slaves. Exodus 21, verses 12 through 27, you have law concerning violence. And Exodus 21, verses 28 through 36, you have laws concerning animal control. So what you're going to have here is the practical application of the 10 Commandments in Israel as a society. Israel was a physical, political empire, a nation of people. And so they had to have these laws to regulate themselves under the will of God. So these laws are described in verse 1 as he says, "Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them." That word judgments can be translated ordinances. And what we're going to see as we go through this, we're going to see how that many of our laws, many of them in the United States of America, find their roots back in the law of Moses. And we're going to see that clearly set forth as we read through these and we think about the laws that we have today. They're based upon, those laws that we have in our society are based upon biblical principles. And we will see that. Chapter 21 of Exodus, verse 1, "Now these are the judgments or ordinances which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free and pay nothing." Now he's going to talk about the regulation of servants or slaves. Now keep in mind the servant or the slave here that's being talked about. In the ancient times, it didn't matter what color your skin was concerning slavery. And here he's even talking about a fellow Hebrew. The slavery there involved someone who would attach themselves to a family, have a master. And there were certain guidelines by which God says this is how you treat this servant or this slave. And when you go into the New Testament, you see those regulations as well, as Paul in the book of Colossians and also in the book of Ephesians talks about how that the master and the slave are supposed to have this relationship in which they're equal to one another. In fact, you look at the small book of Philemon in the New Testament, you find God is writing to a slave owner by the name of Philemon and telling him that Onesimus, that I'm sending back to you, is no longer just a servant or a slave. He's your brother in Christ. He's been converted. So what the Bible does concerning the slave-master relationship, it humbles the master and it elevates the slave, putting them on equal terms. Equal terms. So that is the exalted nature of what the Bible does. But there is responsibilities. As you see here in verse 2, if you have a Hebrew servant, he serves for you 6 years, and in the 7th year, he shall go out free and pay nothing. So he can, for 6 years, serve you, and then on that 7th year, he can go free. Now, as we're going to see later on, he can make the choice to be a lifelong servant in that household. But it's up to him. See, it's a higher, exalted way of dealing with the servant-master or servant-slave relationship. Verse 3, "If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him." So if he comes into this situation where he becomes a servant in a household, and he comes in with a wife, he is to go out with that wife. Verse 4, "If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, The wife and her children shall be her masters, and he shall go out by himself. Verse 5. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Now here's a situation where the master has acquired the servant has acquired a family in the slave-master relationship. And he has the choice of leaving, but he has also the choice of staying. Notice verse 5. But if the servant or the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, my children, I will not go free. In other words, he's not going to take the option of going free. Then he has this option of staying with that family. Now think about this. Why in the world would a slave want to stay with a master and say, I love that master? Because that master treated that slave the way he should be treated. And in fact, later on in the chapter, it's going to give information concerning if you abuse your slave, your servant, that servant can go free. If you do physical harm to that master, whether you put out, or to that slave, whether you put out his eye, knock out a tooth, that slave is free to go. So here you have a situation, the servant will love the master and say, I will stay with him, and I love my wife and my children, and I will not go free. And here's what happens. Verse 6, his master shall bring him to the judges. So you bring this situation before the judges of Israel. And if that is agreed upon, he shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost of his master, and shall pierce his ear with an awl. So there's going to be a piercing of the ear to indicate, I am a slave or a servant of this household for the rest of my life. Now that's voluntary on his part. And that is because he loved that master, and the only way that that would happen is if that master treated that slave and that family the way they should be treated and did not misuse them. Look at verse 7. If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as male slaves do. If she does not please her master, verse 8, who has betrothed her to himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. Look at verse 9. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of the daughters. Verse 10. If he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. Verse 11. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go free without paying money. In other words, if she is not treated right, she doesn't have to buy her freedom. She can go free if the master is not conducting himself as he should. So there's a responsibility there in the nation of Israel for the master to treat the slave properly, with respect, as a human being. You know, that was unheard of in the ancient world, and for the most part in our country to a certain extent. To treat the slave as an equal. But the Bible makes it very clear that all men are equal in the sight of God, that we are all one in Christ as far as Christians are concerned, whether bond or free. So you have the regulation here in verses 1 through 11 of the masters with their slaves. And as you see in verse 2, they have the option after a 6-year period of time. In the 7th year, they can be set free. They can have that freedom. So it was not obligated for them unless they chose to be a slave with that master for life. Look at verse 12, Exodus 21:12. Remember, verses 12 through 27, he's going to talk about laws concerning violence. Violence in a society. Here's how God deals with violence in a society. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. It's pretty simple. That goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 9, that if you shed man's blood, your blood is to be shed because man is created in the image of God. If you murder someone, and you can't murder animals, you murder a fellow human being, according to the law of God, within the society of Israel, that person is to be put to death. Now, in our country, that used to be a quick procedure. Now it lasts 20, 30 years. They sit on death row with appeal after an appeal after an appeal. And it becomes almost a mockery. People, the crime is so old, people have forgotten about what the person did 20 or 30 years ago to deserve the death penalty. However, it was pretty swift. And that's a guarantee. If you put to death a murderer, that murderer will never commit that crime again. Ever. I mean, that is a surefire guarantee. And you know what we have in our society? The problem is, even with all our surveillance, even with all our technology to track people, people still break out of prison. And those people who are dangerous break out of prison, who should have already been put to death, and then they go out and they kill someone else. In Israel, when they followed this, they didn't have that problem. You put that person to death. And in the New Testament, we see that the Bible makes it very clear. Romans chapter 13 talks about the government bears the sword and is an avenger of those that do evil. Well, with a sword you put to death. God has given government, earthly governments, the right to invoke the death penalty on those who commit crimes worthy of death. Exodus 21 and verse 13. However, if he did not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. Now here you have a situation in verse 13, what we would call involuntary manslaughter. That's where we got that in our society, in which you accidentally, in a process of doing something, kill someone. And it says here, if he did not lie in wait, in other words, it's not premeditated, but God delivered him into his hand, then I'll appoint for you a place that he may flee. He goes to this place, and it says there in verse 14 that it's at the altar. That the altar that the person may go to seek a place where he can be safe from any type of criminal charges, so to speak. And also cities of refuge, right. Cities of refuge they can flee to. That's exactly right. 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 28, I believe, talks about an incident where they grabbed hold of the altar, where someone grabbed hold of the altar to try to flee from the sentence of death. But notice verse 14. But if a man acts with premeditation against his neighbor to kill by treachery, you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. Now here's the scenario. Let's put it in a modern day setting. Someone's out driving their car, and they run over someone accidentally and kill them. Involuntary manslaughter. That was an accident. Now, similar situation. Someone gets in a car and intentionally runs over someone to kill them. Still killed him with a car, but that's murder. That's exactly what we have in our society. You get in a car and you intentionally run over someone to kill them, you've murdered them. You get in a car and you accidentally run over someone and kill them, that's involuntary manslaughter. That God recognizes that sometimes are accidents that happen. And therefore that person who accidentally killed someone is not to be charged with murder. But the person who does acts with premeditation. Isn't that what they try to present in a court of law? Premeditation in a person is being tried for murder. That they acted with premeditation. And that person is to be put to death. Drunk driver. There are situations like that in which a person kills. They know they shouldn't be drinking and driving. The law plainly says you don't do it. And then they get in behind the wheel and then they kill somebody. I mean, you have situation after situation in which these things happen. Look at verse 15. He who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. That's pretty severe. You strike your father or your mother, they don't launch an investigation and say, well, what did the father or mother do? Perhaps that father and mother, limited that child in some way that it could not play as it should or did not feed it when it wanted to. And no, the Bible says you strike mother or father. It's such a sacred relationship. If you do that, that child is to be put to death. That's how God sees a situation where a child would have the audacity to strike father or mother. Doesn't matter that they were mad. Doesn't matter that they were upset. God says if you do that, you die. Because if that little kid is willing to strike mother and father, what kind of adult is that little kid going to grow up to be? He's going to be a danger on society. So God says, get rid of him now. Get rid of her now. So that there won't be a burden on society later. This is the same God of John 3:16. The same God who sent his son to die on the cross. This is the God who is a God of love. Yet these are the laws that he gave to a society here on earth. Look at verse 16. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. You go out, you kidnap someone. God says put that person to death. It doesn't matter whether they die in the midst of kidnapping that individual or not. The person who would steal another person, God says you put that person to death. By the way, there are 16 crimes under the law of Moses that invoke the death penalty. 16 crimes. Verse 17, he who curses father or his mother shall surely be put to death. How many children in our society would be dead? Who not only, they don't strike physically, but they curse, they speak against their father and mother. God says, let's nip this in the bud, put that child to death. Right. If you spank your child in our society, in some places, you are the mean one. If you take some of these liberal thinkers, transport them in time about 3,500 years ago to the society of Moses, they wouldn't survive. They wouldn't have the ACLU there to help them, sue Moses for all these terrible laws that people think that they are. The Bible says, under this society, that this is to happen. Look at verse 18. If man contend with the other, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die, but is confined to his bed, if he rises again and walks about outside with his staff, then he who struck him shall be acquitted. He shall only pay for the loss of his time, and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. Now here you have a situation where you have two people fight. The person gets hurt, but he doesn't die. Well, the judges are to rule that the person who inflicted that, and this person recovers, you pay him back for the time lost. That's fair. You pay him back for the time lost in which you inflicted the pain on him. He shall only pay for the loss of his time and shall provide for him to be thoroughly healed. In other words, the person who committed this crime is to make sure through payment that that person's medical needs are met. That's fair. You inflicted the injury and you've done this, you need to pay that person for doing that. Verse 20, if a man beats his male or female servants with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Now the punishment there, look at verse 21, notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. Now, verse 20 says, if you kill this male or female servant with a rod, and that servant dies, he shall be punished. Well, based upon what we've seen already, verse 12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. If a master kills his slave, that master is to be put to death. You've killed another human being. You know, in societies of the world that had slavery, that was unheard of. But see, God sees the value of the slave as being the same as the value of the master, because both are made in the image of God. And so if he does that and he dies, he will be punished. And the punishment at verse 12 would be being put to death. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. In other words, in verse 21, if this person remains alive, this person is not to be punished, because if the slave did something that was worthy of punishment, then punishment is to be inflicted. Verse 21, verse 22. Here's something that's interesting. Verses 22 through 25. You've heard the old saying of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's usually in a setting where a person says, I'm going to get them back, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And they're going to go out and they're going to seek vengeance. They say the good book says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So I'm going to go get them back, seeking vengeance. They're taking it out of context. Here's something in which God, verses 22 through 25, sees the value of the unborn child. The unborn child. Now you compare that with our laws in our society, starting in 1973, that legalized the killing of unborn children in abortion. Here's how God in a society viewed the unborn child. He says, if men fight or strive, some translations say, and hurt a woman with child, notice, she's with child, she's pregnant, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished according as the woman's husband imposes on him. And he shall pay as the judges determine. They're fighting, the pregnant woman gets in the way, she gets hurt, she gives birth, premature birth, yet the baby lives. No harm follows. That person will be punished according to the husband's, what the husband imposes according to the courts. Verse 23, but if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life. Life for life. If that baby dies, the person who accidentally caused the death of that baby is to be put to death. Now you compare that with our laws today in which it's legal to kill an unborn child. God says, if that baby survives, if there's no harm that follows, it may be born premature, but if no harm follows, then the person will be punished according to what the judges determine. But if that baby dies, you give life for life. That person unintentionally took the life of an unborn child and is worthy of death. What are those who intentionally do it today worthy of? Verse 23, but if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life. Verse 24, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Verse 25, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. In other words, whatever you inflict on someone, that is to be inflicted on you. You take a life, you're going to die. That's only fair. That's only fair. You cut off somebody's hand, you injure someone's hand, you lose your hand. Boy, the bleeding heart liberals of our society would start bawling if those kind of laws came into effect in our nation. What about his childhood? What about how he was raised? He was abused. The Bible says, put him to death. Put that person to death. You know, there is no doubt that how a person was raised might have a bearing on how they conduct their life. But that's no excuse. None whatsoever for a person to become a criminal in a society. None whatsoever. Yes? Exactly. That's why God says in His Word, you've raised that child right from the beginning, and there is a high percentage of likelihood that child is going to be what God would have that child be. That's why you teach them from young ages. Deuteronomy chapter 6 talks about you teach those children all the time the will of God so that they might grow up and be productive Christians. And when you have productive Christians and God-fearing people, you have a good society. So here is this is how God views the unborn. And when you take the totality of the Scriptures from Genesis to Revelation, human life begins at conception, and from that point on, that woman is with child. And even if the child accidentally dies in the process of two men struggling, the man who causes that is to give his life for accidentally causing an abortion. Leviticus 24:20. A cross-reference here. Leviticus chapter 24. Say chapter 24. We look at verse 19 and go with it. If a man causes disfigurement of his neighbor, as he has done, so shall it be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has caused disfigurement of a man, so shall it be done to him. It's only fair. If you're going to go out and do something that's ridiculous, like hurt someone else, expect the same thing to come on you. Back to Exodus chapter 21 and verse 26. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. The master is mad at the servant for something, hurts him, puts out his eye, he has automatically set that slave free. Because you don't mistreat your slaves. You don't mistreat your servants. Verse 27, if he knocks out a tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. You get mad and you haul off and hit your servant, knock out a tooth, that servant is automatically free. During this period of time, that was unheard of in society. But God views the value of human beings as being equal in His sight. They might have a particular role to play, like the master and the slave, but as far as value in the sight of God, they are both equal. Just like a male and female in a marriage. The husband is the head, the wife is to submit to her husband. They're equal in the eyes of God, but they have a role to play. Now, verses 28 through 36. Here you have laws concerning animal control. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be acquitted. So here you have a situation where an animal, an ox, and of course it probably in principle apply to any animal. Of course, their society, you had those domesticated animals. If an animal gores a man or a woman to death, the oxen shall surely be stoned, but you're not going to benefit from the death of that animal and not eat that animal. But the owner of the ox shall be acquitted or exempted from punishment. Look at verse 29. But if the ox tended to thrust with his horn in times past, and it has been made known to his owner, and he has not kept it confined so that it kill a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. Now here you have a situation in verse 28 where the ox, without the owner's knowledge of it being dangerous, gets out and kills someone. The owner did not know how dangerous the animal is, so he is not responsible. That's fair. Verse 29, but if he knew that this animal is dangerous, and it's been known to his owner, and he has not kept it confined, so that it kill a man or a woman, the oxen shall be killed, and its owner is going to be put to death because of the irresponsibility of the owner. You did not confine this animal, whether it be a dog or whatever. You make the application of whatever animal that's dangerous. You knew that it was dangerous. You did not keep it in a situation where it would not hurt people, and it got out and killed someone. That animal is to be put to death. Try to do that in our society, and you'll get PETA all over you. Then you're to put to death the owner. Yes. Mm-hmm. There's examples of that in our society all the time of animals getting loose, dogs getting loose, or dogs not being kept as they should, and getting loose and hurting children, hurting people. That, again, killing that animal, you guarantee that animal is not going to hurt anyone else again. You kill the animal, it's not going to hurt anyone else again. And then if the owner is irresponsible and cause the death of someone because of his irresponsibility, the animal is supposed to be killed, and that owner is to be put to death because of his irresponsibility. Verse 30. If there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life whatever is imposed on him. Whether it has gored a son or gored a daughter, according to his judgment, it shall be done to him. If the oxen gores a male or female servant, he shall give to the master 30 shekels of silver, and the oxen shall be stoned. And this is because if the male or female servant there is hurt or injured, it doesn't say killed, but hurt or injured, that is service that's taken away from the master, and so you need to compensate him for the situation, 30 shekels of silver in that situation. No. It says, if the oxen gores a male or female servant, he shall give to the master, the person who owns the animal, 30 shekels of silver, and the oxen shall be stoned. So that the owner of that oxen, if he gores a male or female servant, and obviously in the context here, and they don't die, they're just injured, you've taken away service from the master, and you need to pay for the recovery of those who got hurt. You compensate them for what has happened. And again, the animals will be put to death to guarantee it will never happen again if the animal's dead. Verse 33, if a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to their owner, but the dead animal shall be his. So here you have the responsibility of a man who digs a pit, and he digs a pit and does not cover it, and an oxen or a donkey falls into it. And he says here in verse 34, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to the owner. You pay the owner of the animal that fell into your pit that you did not cover up. That's fair. Verse 35, if one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox shall also divide. So here you have one animal hurting another animal that it dies. Here's what you're supposed to do in verse 35. You divide the money, you sell the live ox, divide the money from it, and the dead ox you shall also divide. Verse 36. Or if it was known that the ox tended to thrust in times past, and its owner has not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead animal shall be his own. You pay for that ox. You have this other ox, and he kills this ox. It's only fair you pay for an ox. And he says here, the dead animal shall be his own. You give the dead animal to the guy that has the dangerous ox. And these are rules and laws in a society that's fair. And we see here that several times the death penalty is invoked concerning various things, murder, disobedience and striking of parents, kidnapping. All of those things, God says with that individual, you get them out of society. You get them out of society. You don't lock them up for life. You get them out of society because they're dangerous. Some people are too dangerous to live. That's how God views things. And so the United States of America would do well to listen to these things on which this nation was founded. These laws. What did they used to do to horse thieves? Hang them. I mean, for stealing a horse. But if you put him to death, he's never going to steal a horse again. You get rid of the wicked person out of society. It's all about suing and money and greed and pride. It's all about that. And so we have the chaos in our society that we're seeing in the news almost on a weekly basis. We'll continue next week, Lord willing.